When no contact begins, one of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that silence means the same thing to both people. It doesn't. Two people can experience the exact same separation and have completely different internal reactions. One person may feel the loss immediately, while the other appears completely unaffected. But appearance and emotional reality are not always the same thing. This is especially important when we talk about an empath and an avoidant. The empath often feels the pain first. The connection was emotionally significant, so when communication suddenly stops, there is an immediate sense of absence. The mind starts searching for an explanation. What happened? Did I do something wrong? Did they ever care? Why haven't they reached out? Should I send one more message? And this is where the empath can become trapped, not necessarily because they are weak, but because their mind is attempting to restore emotional certainty. Human beings naturally dislike unresolved emotional situations. When there is no clear ending, the brain keeps returning to the unfinished story. Every memory becomes evidence. Every silence becomes a possible message. Every small detail gets analyzed. The empath may not simply be missing the person, they may be trying to make sense of the entire relationship. Meanwhile, the avoidant may appear calmer. They may continue working, socializing, exercising, watching television, spending time online, or simply behaving as though nothing significant has happened. From the outside, it can look like they have moved on instantly. But here is the distinction that matters. Emotional expression and emotional experience are not the same thing. Someone can experience an emotion without displaying it. Someone can suppress an emotion without resolving it. And someone can feel temporary relief from distance without having permanently lost attachment. For an avoidantly oriented person, separation can initially reduce emotional pressure. If closeness has become associated with expectations, vulnerability, conflict, responsibility, or the fear of losing independence, then distance can feel like control returning. The nervous system may interpret space as safety. So while the empath is thinking, how could they walk away so easily? The avoidant may genuinely be experiencing something closer to, at least I can breathe now. That difference can be incredibly painful for the empath because they interpret the absence of visible suffering as evidence that the relationship meant nothing. But that conclusion is too simplistic. The emotional process may simply be occurring on different timelines. The empath often moves toward the pain. They think about it. They talk about it. They analyze it. They cry over it. They search for meaning in it. In psychological terms, they are confronting the emotional stimulus directly. The avoidant may move away from the pain, they may suppress it, compartmentalize it, distract themselves, rationalize the breakup, or convince themselves that the relationship was too complicated anyway. And suppression can create a strange psychological illusion. If you push something away long enough, you can temporarily stop feeling its intensity, but you haven't necessarily eliminated the underlying attachment. You have simply changed your relationship with the emotion. This is why the first stage of no contact can be so deceptive. The person who is suffering visibly may eventually become the person who heals most completely. The person who appears unaffected may eventually be forced to confront emotions that were postponed rather than resolved. And this is where the empath needs to be extremely careful. Do not turn no contact into a psychological experiment designed to make the avoidant miss you. Do not count the days waiting for a message. Do not constantly check whether they viewed your profile. Do not interpret every song, post, or online activity as a hidden signal. Because the moment no contact becomes a strategy for controlling another person's emotions, you are still emotionally connected to the outcome. Real no contact is different. It is not punishment. It is not manipulation. It is not a performance. It is the decision to stop abandoning yourself in an attempt to remain emotionally connected to someone else. And eventually, something begins to change inside the empath. The question moves from, why don't they miss me? To, why was I willing to keep hurting myself for someone who could not meet me where I was? Worse, death is a profound psychological shift, because healing does not begin when the other person finally suffers. Healing begins when their suffering is no longer required for you to feel valuable. The empath may feel the pain first, but feeling pain first does not mean losing. Sometimes it means you are confronting reality before the other person is ready to do the same. The person who faces the pain can transform it. The person who avoids it may only postpone it. Now, once you understand that the empath and the avoidant can experience the same separation in completely different ways, the next question becomes even more important. Why does no contact create such opposite reactions in the first place? Because people don't simply respond to loss. They respond to what loss means to their nervous system. For one person, distance can feel like rejection. For another, distance can feel like relief. For one person, silence creates anxiety and a desperate need for answers. For another, silence creates space and a temporary sense of control. The event is identical, but the internal interpretation is completely different. This is why you cannot measure someone's attachment by how quickly they respond to separation. The empath may experience no contact as an emotional vacuum. Suddenly, the conversations stop. The familiar routines disappear. There is no message in the morning, no person to tell something important to, no emotional feedback from the relationship. The mind notices the missing connection because connection was part of how the empath experienced emotional stability. And when that connection disappears, the mind wants to restore it. This is where overthinking begins. The empath may replay conversations, examine facial expressions, analyze the last argument, remember the moments of affection, and search for the exact point where everything changed. The mind is attempting to create a coherent story from an emotionally incomplete situation, but the avoidant may experience the same silence differently. If closeness has previously triggered feelings of pressure, vulnerability, engulfment, or loss of independence, then distance can initially reduce those uncomfortable sensations. The avoidant may suddenly feel calmer, not necessarily because they don't care, but because the immediate demands of emotional intimacy have disappeared. And this is where people make a serious mistake. They confuse relief with indifference. Relief can simply mean that the nervous system has moved away from something it perceived as emotionally overwhelming. It doesn't automatically tell you whether attachment exists underneath it. Think about it this way. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack all day. When you finally put it down, you feel relief. But feeling relief doesn't mean you hated the backpack, and it doesn't mean the journey meant nothing. It simply means the pressure was real. The same principle can apply to emotional closeness. An avoidant person may genuinely care about someone while simultaneously feeling uncomfortable with the intensity of intimacy. Those two realities can exist at the same time. This is why some avoidant individuals become emotionally distant when a relationship gets closer, then begin missing the person once the relationship becomes distant. Closeness activates one set of fears. Distance activates another, and the person becomes caught between wanting connection and wanting protection. The empath can experience almost the opposite sequence. Distance activates the fear of losing connection. So they move toward the person psychologically, even when physically they are trying to stay away. They want answers. They want reassurance. They want closure. The avoidant may move in the opposite direction. When emotions become intense, they create distance to regulate themselves. This creates a devastating dynamic. One person moves closer because they are afraid of losing the relationship. The other moves farther away because they are afraid of losing themselves. And the more each person reacts according to their fear, the more the other person's fear is activated. That is the cycle. The empath thinks, if I can just show them how much I care, they will finally feel safe enough to come closer. The avoidant thinks, consciously or unconsciously, if I can just create enough distance, I can finally feel safe again. Neither person necessarily understands that they are responding to an internal alarm system, and this is why chasing after an avoidant during no contact can become counterproductive. If distance is what temporarily helps them regulate emotional pressure, repeated messages and demands for reassurance can reinforce the very feeling they are trying to escape. But there is another side to this. If the empath constantly pursues, explains, forgives, and waits, they may accidentally train themselves to believe that love requires emotional exhaustion. That is not love. That is emotional conditioning. The purpose of understanding attachment psychology is not to label one person as good and the other as bad. It is to understand the pattern well enough to stop participating in it unconsciously. You cannot heal a relationship by becoming more desperate. And you cannot create genuine intimacy by forcing someone to confront emotions they are not prepared to face. Sometimes the healthiest response is to stop trying to control the other person's emotional process and start taking responsibility for your own. Let them have their distance. Let yourself have your peace. Because the real power of no contact is not that it makes somebody miss you. The real power is that it gives both people enough psychological space to discover what remains when the emotional noise disappears. And eventually, the question changes. You stop asking, how can I make them understand what they lost? And you start asking, what have I learned about myself through this experience? That is where emotional intelligence begins. Silence does not create the truth. It reveals what was already there. And this brings us to one of the most misunderstood moments in the entire no-contact process. The moment the avoidant realizes that the empath is not simply taking a temporary step back, but is actually becoming unavailable. Because there is a profound psychological difference between someone being silent and someone genuinely moving on. An avoidant person may become accustomed to a certain pattern. The relationship becomes difficult, distance appears, emotions settle, and eventually the empath reaches out again. Maybe they send a message, maybe they ask for closure, maybe they apologize for something they did not even need to apologize for, maybe they simply check in. And when that happens repeatedly, a psychological expectation can develop. The avoidant may unconsciously believe they will always be there, not necessarily because they are intentionally manipulative. Sometimes it is simply conditioning. The brain learns patterns through repetition. If someone repeatedly leaves and returns, then eventually their return becomes expected. But no contact changes the pattern. At first, the avoidant may not notice. They may experience the silence as normal. In fact, they may enjoy it. There is less emotional pressure, fewer conversations, fewer questions, fewer expectations. They may tell themselves that the separation was necessary. They may feel confident that they made the right decision. And then time passes. There is no message, no emotional explanation, no attempt to restart the conversation, no familiar name appearing on the phone. And eventually, something psychologically important happens. The brain begins to recognize the absence as permanent rather than temporary. That is often where the emotional experience can change. The person who was once assumed to be available is suddenly unavailable, and this can create what psychologists often describe as a prediction error. The mind expects one outcome based on previous experience, but reality produces another. The avoidant may have expected the empath to return, but the empath doesn't. Now the mind has to update its model. What if they really are gone? That question can be more powerful than the silence itself. Because human beings often become more aware of something when access to it is removed. Think about how easily we overlook something that is constantly available. The moment it disappears, its psychological value can become much more obvious. This does not mean every avoidant will suddenly chase, apologize, or return. That's important. No contact is not a guaranteed method for getting someone back, but it can reveal something that constant communication often hides. It can reveal whether the connection was being sustained by genuine mutual desire or by one person's continuous emotional effort. When the empath stops carrying the relationship itself becomes visible. And this is where the empath has to exercise enormous discipline. Because the moment the avoidant finally notices the absence, there can be a temptation to break no contact immediately. A message arrives. Maybe it's casual. Hey, how have you been? Maybe it is nostalgic. I was just thinking about you. Maybe it is indirect. I saw something that reminded me of you. And suddenly all the emotions that the empath worked so hard to regulate come rushing back. The mistake is assuming that contact automatically means transformation. It doesn't. Missing someone is not the same as being ready to build a healthy relationship with them. Loneliness is not commitment. Nostalgia is not emotional maturity. And curiosity is not necessarily love. This distinction can save someone months or even years of emotional confusion. The real question isn't, did they come back? The real question is, what are they coming back with? Are they bringing accountability? Are they willing to communicate differently? Are they capable of consistency? Are they prepared to address the problems that created the distance? Or are they simply uncomfortable with losing access to someone who once made themselves emotionally available? Those are completely different things. And this is where the empath's transformation becomes critical. At some point, the empath has to stop measuring their worth through another person's reaction. If the avoidant returns, you don't automatically win. If the avoidant doesn't return, you don't automatically lose. Your value existed before the relationship, during the relationship, and after the relationship. No contact becomes powerful when it stops being about getting a reaction and starts being about reclaiming psychological autonomy. Because when you stop chasing someone, you begin to hear your own thoughts again. You start noticing how much energy was spent monitoring another person's emotions. You recognize how often you ignored your own needs just to maintain connection. And eventually, something changes. You don't necessarily stop caring overnight. You simply stop abandoning yourself to prove that you care. That is the real turning point. The avoidant may eventually realize that the empath is gone, but by then the empath may have realized something even more important. They were never supposed to spend their life waiting to be chosen. The deepest consequence of no contact isn't that someone finally notices your absence. It is that you finally notice your own presence. When you stop chasing their attention, you begin reclaiming your own. And this is where the entire meaning of no contact begins to change, because eventually the empath reaches a point where the goal is no longer to make the avoidant understand the pain they caused. The goal becomes something much more important, rebuilding the relationship you have with yourself. In the beginning, no contact can feel like deprivation. You are not talking to the person you were emotionally connected to. You are not receiving the reassurance you once received. You are not checking their messages, explaining your feelings, or trying to repair the distance. And because the nervous system was accustomed to that connection, the silence can feel uncomfortable. But discomfort is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes discomfort is the beginning of change. Think about what happens when a familiar routine disappears. Your mind initially reaches for it automatically. You may reach for your phone without thinking. You may wonder what the other person is doing. You may imagine what you would say if they contacted you. You may even create conversations in your head that never happen in reality. That is the mind trying to maintain a familiar emotional pattern. But patterns weaken when they are no longer reinforced. This is why genuine no contact can eventually become transformative. Every time you resist the urge to chase, you are teaching yourself something. I can experience discomfort without immediately reacting to it. That is emotional self-regulation. And emotional self-regulation is one of the clearest signs of psychological growth. The empath often has a tremendous capacity to understand other people's emotions. They can sense changes in tone. They notice subtle shifts in behavior. They recognize when someone is upset before that person says anything. But there is a danger in becoming highly attuned to everyone else. You can become so focused on understanding another person's emotional world that you lose contact with your own. You start asking, why are they pulling away? Instead of asking, why am I accepting this? You ask, what are they feeling? Instead of asking, what am I feeling? You analyze their behavior while ignoring the effect their behavior is having on your life, and no contact can interrupt that pattern. Suddenly, there is nobody else's emotional state to monitor. You have to sit with yourself, and that can be uncomfortable because silence removes distraction. You begin to see the relationship more clearly. You remember the moments when you were constantly anxious. You recognize how often you questioned your worth. You notice how frequently you were waiting for reassurance. You remember the promises you made to yourself that you repeatedly broke just to preserve the connection. And perhaps the most painful realization is this: sometimes you weren't only grieving the person, you were grieving the version of yourself that existed around them. The version of you who kept hoping, the version of you who kept explaining, the version of you who believed that if you could just love harder, communicate better, become more patient, or become more understanding, eventually the relationship would become emotionally secure. But love cannot compensate for the absence of mutual willingness. You cannot create emotional safety for two people by yourself, and you cannot heal a dynamic that both people are not willing to examine. This is where the empath begins moving from emotional dependence toward emotional independence. And emotional independence does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean pretending you don't care. It does not mean becoming avoidant yourself. It means you can care about someone without making their behavior the foundation of your emotional stability. That is a completely different level of strength. You can miss someone and still maintain your boundary. You can love someone and still refuse inconsistency. You can understand someone's wounds without allowing those wounds to become an excuse for hurting you. And perhaps most importantly, you can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access to you. That is maturity. Because healing is not about eliminating emotion. Healing is about developing the capacity to experience emotion without allowing it to control your decisions. The empath eventually discovers that peace feels different from emotional intensity. At first, peace can feel boring. There is no dramatic message, no sudden disappearance, no guessing game, no emotional roller coaster. But slowly, the nervous system begins to appreciate what chaos once prevented you from noticing. You sleep better, you think more clearly, you become more present. You begin investing energy into your goals, friendships, work, creativity, spirituality, health, and future. And something remarkable happens. You stop organizing your life around whether someone else is coming back. You begin organizing your life around where you are going. That is the real transformation. And if the avoidant eventually notices your absence, that is their psychological process to confront. You don't need to interrupt your healing just because someone else has finally become aware of what they lost. Your responsibility is not to manage their realization. Your responsibility is to protect your own. Because the greatest victory after no contact is not receiving a message that says, "I miss you." It is reaching a place where that message no longer determines your worth. The empath's deepest transformation happens when they stop asking, "How do I get them back?" and begin asking, "How do I get myself back?" No contact is not about becoming unreachable to someone else. It is about becoming fully available to yourself. And now we arrive at the question that people usually want answered more than anything else. Who actually suffers more after no contact, the avoidant or the empath? The honest answer is more complicated than most people want it to be, because suffering is not always visible. The empath may suffer loudly on the inside. They may cry, overthink, replay conversations, feel the absence intensely, and struggle with the unanswered questions. Their pain is often immediate because they are willing to emotionally confront what happened. The avoidant may look completely fine. They may continue their routine. They may appear confident. They may socialize, work, exercise, post online, or even seem happier than before. But you cannot accurately measure emotional pain by external behavior. Some people process pain by moving toward it. Others process pain by moving away from it. And this distinction is critical. The empath often asks, "Why am I hurting so much?" But perhaps a better question is, "What am I doing with the pain?" Because pain itself is not the enemy. Unprocessed pain is. If the empath feels the loss and uses it as an opportunity for self-reflection, they can eventually turn that experience into wisdom. They begin understanding their boundaries, their attachment patterns, their emotional needs, and the places where they may have tolerated too little for too long. The pain becomes information. The pain says, "Something mattered here," but it can also say, "Something needs to change." The avoidant may have a different psychological journey. If their primary strategy is emotional suppression, distance can provide immediate relief. They may tell themselves that everything is fine because the uncomfortable emotional stimulus is no longer directly in front of them. But emotional avoidance has a fundamental limitation. You can postpone an emotion. You cannot guarantee that it has disappeared. Eventually, the distractions become quieter. The relationship is no longer an immediate crisis. The emotional intensity settles, and that is sometimes when memories begin returning. A familiar place, a song, a photograph, a message thread, a specific phrase the person used to say. A moment that seemed insignificant at the time suddenly becomes meaningful. This is why delayed emotional processing can be so powerful. Once the external pressure is gone, the mind may finally have enough psychological space to process what it previously avoided. But again, this does not mean every avoidant eventually suffers intensely or returns. Human beings are too complex for that kind of guarantee. The deeper principle is simply this: avoidance and healing are not the same thing. Likewise, feeling pain and losing are not the same thing. This is where the empath needs to stop turning healing into a competition. If they suffer more, then I win. If they miss me, then I mattered. If they come back, then they finally understand. Those thoughts keep you psychologically connected to the same person you are trying to detach from. You may have stopped texting them, but you are still emotionally waiting for their reaction. That is not freedom. That is silent attachment. Real healing begins when you no longer need to know whether they regret losing you. You don't need to see their pain to validate your own. You don't need their apology to prove that you were hurt. You don't need their return to prove that the relationship was meaningful. Your experience is real, whether or not another person acknowledges it. And this is where the philosophical lesson becomes much deeper. We often assume that the strongest person is the one who feels the least, but emotional strength is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to feel deeply without surrendering your identity to what you feel. The empath who can say, "I miss you, but I will not abandon myself to have you," has developed something far more powerful than emotional detachment. They have developed self-respect, and the avoidant has their own lesson to learn. Distance can protect you from emotional discomfort, but it can also protect you from emotional intimacy. If you continually escape whenever vulnerability appears, eventually you may create the very loneliness you were trying to avoid. You cannot build deep connection while permanently protecting yourself from the risks that make deep connection possible. So who suffers more? Perhaps the better question is, who remains trapped longer? The person who feels the pain and processes it can eventually move forward. The person who continually suppresses the pain may carry it into the next relationship, the next connection, and the next chapter of life. That is why no contact should never be used as psychological warfare. Use it as clarity. Use it as space. Use it as a boundary. Use it as an opportunity to observe your own patterns without immediately reacting to them. And if someone returns, don't simply ask whether they missed you. Ask whether the relationship can now exist differently. Ask whether there is accountability. Ask whether there is consistency. Ask whether both people have actually changed, because missing someone is easy. Building something healthy with them is the difficult part. And if they never return, your healing does not become meaningless. You still gain something. You gain the ability to stand alone without feeling incomplete. You gain the ability to choose peace over emotional chaos. You gain the ability to love without losing yourself. And ultimately, that may be the greatest answer to the entire question. The empath may suffer first. The avoidant may suffer later, but the person who learns from the experience suffers once and grows. Don't measure your healing by how much they miss you. Measure it by how little you need them